Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, looks peaceful in the first winter snow. But just 500 miles southeast of here, a war has claimed 10,000 lives, including the soldiers memorialized on this wall. It's a conflict that's inflamed tensions between the U.S. and Russia like nothing since the Cold War. Russia has portrayed it as a civil war, Ukrainian versus Ukrainian. But at a Ukrainian military training camp about an hour from Kiev, soldiers we met had no doubt about who they were fighting.
Against Russian aggressors who are coming to our country. It's a fight against Russian terrorists, in my opinion.
I believe that there would be no conflict if the Russian troops did not enter the territory of Ukraine.
Russia sees Ukraine as part of its sphere of influence, and I think Russia would like to ensure that Ukraine is not an independent actor.
Marie Ivanovich is the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. She says Ukraine has steadily been turning westward, seeking closer ties with NATO and the European Union. Tension reached a boiling point when Ukraine's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, turned his back on a Western trade pact in 2013, and pro-European protesters took to the Maidan, Kiev's main square. The protests were pro-European, anti-corruption, and overwhelmingly peaceful. They braved months of cold and brutal police crackdowns that claimed dozens of lives. Eventually, after 3 months, President Yanukovych fled to Russia. The pro-European protesters had won.
I think the Russians were angry over this, and so the first move that we saw was the infamous little green men in Crimea, a part of Ukraine. Men arriving in uniform, in green uniforms, but no identification, and they denied sort of that they were anything but, people from Crimea. And within a matter of days, really, Crimea was taken over by Russian forces. So when a part of Europe is attacked, that is not good for stability, it's not good for security, it's not of Ukraine, but also more broadly of Europe, one of our best partners.
The U.S. and EU responded to the Russian occupation of Crimea with stiff sanctions, but the crisis in the south was followed shortly by another crisis in the east of Ukraine, in the region known as Donbas. Pro-Russian separatists took over entire towns, declaring independence, further dividing Ukrainians from one another. But who were the separatists? According to Yuri Boyko, a pro-Russian member of parliament, they were simply local Ukrainians who felt threatened by the Maidan protests and the new pro-West government in Kiev.
People in the east of Ukraine didn't understand what is happening in Kiev. They saw the blood, they saw shootings, they were frightened. They are speaking in Russian, they were closer to Russia.
So the Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine
were afraid.
They were afraid and they felt closer to Russia than to the country of Ukraine.
In this situation, yes.
Is this a civil war or is Russia an aggressor?
It is civil war with the Russian support.
This is not a civil war. I think that's part of a Russian disinformation campaign.
So we know that Russia is operating in these areas?
Yes, we do.
It's not Russian-speaking pro-Russian forces who are Ukrainian. These are Russians operating in eastern Ukraine.
The Russians are controlling both the civil administration as well as the fighting. And they can turn it up and they can turn it down. And we've seen that.
Along the contact line,
there is a ceasefire in place, but it's constantly being violated, according to Alexander Hug, who monitors the conflict for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The OSCE has more than 600 monitors on both sides of the contact line, documenting fighting like this: firing from howitzers, nighttime attacks on the water system in Donetsk, and mortar explosions in the town of Avdiivka.
So at least as far as Ukraine is concerned, this is no Cold War.
It is a very active war. We see on a daily basis thousands of ceasefire violations, and we continue to register the suffering of the civilian population that often live very closely or actually on the contact line between positions.
Well, who's breaking this ceasefire? I mean, you're on the ground. What have you seen?
We know that both sides do not adhere to the ceasefire. Both sides maintain positions too close to one another, and both sides do keep heavy weapons in areas where they have agreed these weapons, tanks, mortar, artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, should not be.
This is one example of an area where we see fighting.
we decided to go to Avdiivka to see the front line ourselves. Our trip began with a 6-hour train ride southeast from Kiev to the town of Slovyansk. In the early days of the war, this road from the train station was dubbed Sniper Alley. It was one of the first towns to be taken by rebels in 2014.
Right behind me is a mental facility that they occupied and used to launch mortar attacks on the Ukrainian forces out there in the distance, about where the woods are.
Caught in the middle, villagers like 59-year-old Yuri, a car mechanic whose house was destroyed by shelling. Although he has Russian roots, his children fled to Russia for safety. He stayed behind to rebuild the family home.
How can I feel Russian? I'm Ukrainian.
Eventually, the Ukrainian army bombed the mental hospital and retook the town, moving the contact line about 60 miles south to our destination, Avdiivka. To get there, we needed to cross checkpoints we weren't allowed to film. We started out early in the morning on roads pockmarked by shelling. The Donbas region of Ukraine is rich in natural resources and farmland, but many fields are off limits because of the possibility of landmines. Avdiivka is in the so-called gray zone. We're told it's safe during daylight hours. Most of the shelling happens at night. After more than 3 years of fighting, people have grown used to it. We found this woman selling handmade items by the side of the road. Knitting calms her nerves, she tells us. Water, heat, and electricity are sporadic, with infrastructure constantly being damaged in the fighting and needing repair. Suffering the most are smaller villages, like Kamyanka, just outside Avdiivka. 78-year-old Valentina Shmatak has lived here her whole life. She points to the front. There, she says, just across the highway. There was shelling just last night, she says. For Hannah Javid, a psychologist with the International Red Cross, has been visiting this village weekly. She points out a root cellar where more than a dozen of the villagers are forced to take cover on a regular basis.
Can you imagine? This is the place they live.
They'll sleep in here.
Yeah, they don't sleep. Basically, they bring their small stools and they just sit here. There's no place to sleep here. It's cold. It's stinky. There's no electricity. And they have gone through hell because many of their children are in different parts of the world. So they are not able to meet them. They're not able to speak to them. And they also lie to them, telling them that we are fine. We are all right, because they don't want to kind of get them worried.
We asked Valentina how the Red Cross has helped her.
They bring us different things and talk to us. That's the only outlet for us. We never have rest here.
The fighting is at a stalemate that's injured or killed more than 400 civilians last year alone. Both sides have called for UN peacekeepers, but talks have not gotten far, and there is a risk this conflict will escalate. The U.S. is upping the ante, announcing last month it will allow the sale of lethal anti-tank weapons to Ukrainian forces like those training near Kiev. Russia sees this as another provocation. Meanwhile, some say Russia's strategy has backfired. You see the signs everywhere: EU flags, anti-Putin paraphernalia. On this monument in Kiev, the People's Friendship Arch built by Soviets in the early 1980s, the Russian writing has been defaced and replaced by the words, "Glory to Ukraine." Nadia Vivchar is a student originally from Western Ukraine, now living in Kiev.
The conflict in Crimea and then in Eastern Ukraine, has that united the country?
It has united people, actually. So before this conflict actually started, I really didn't feel that much of patriotic feelings towards Ukraine. And now, with all of these events and my friends going to Eastern part to fight, and it makes people unite. It makes us unite, not against somebody, but to protect ourselves.
And here we had
Svetlana Zalishchuk agrees. One of the original pro-European protesters, she's a member of parliament now and says Ukrainians are unified like never before.
People think that it's kind of Western Ukraine chose the West and Eastern Ukraine chose the Russia. And this is not true. 70% of our soldiers who went voluntarily to fight, they are Russian-speaking people. You can speak Russian, you can have relatives in Russia. But It was a choice not of the language or nationality, it was a choice of the future. And we are a country that has for sure a democratic future.